Welcome to the Business of Sustainability podcast from FuturePlus, where smart businesses turn sustainability challenges into a competitive advantage. I'm Alex Smith, bringing you real stories from leaders who've transformed ESG pressures into opportunities for growth, innovation, and a stronger market position. Let's dive in. So first things first, if you need a practical ESG framework, a small plug, we have built a free 1-hour course at FuturePlus. You can find it at future-plus.co.uk/ESG lessons. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming back Damien, Stork and Jonathan Hook from CHX Performance onto the show. Damien, Jonathan, very welcome back. I should say, it's been, I think, 18 months, 2 years since we last spoke. But it was one of our most popular episodes and something that people talk to us about all the time. But for those that maybe haven't listened to that first episode, could you introduce yourselves, a little bit of background and what CHX Performance does?
First of all, thanks for having us back, Alex. Absolute pleasure. And we love working with you. Doesn't feel like 2 years, does it?
No.
So we work with organisations, specifically in leadership, senior management at that tier of organisations, to help build capacity into their ability to deliver against the targets they set themselves. So we really be working the people element of the organisation, looking at how we can increase sustainability of people within their roles in the search for those shared goals that the companies tend to set, which are only increasing in a very, very complex world. So it's about helping people build and sustain capacity.
Yeah, I think about that. Loads of leadership development work focuses on leaders' capabilities, their skills. We ask organisations a very different question, and one that we help them answer is your performance of your leaders about capabilities and skills, or is it about their capacity to be the capable and skillful leader that you want them to be, and that the leader will want themselves to be, not just for themselves, but for the organisation? So what is capacity? How would you define it? And what are the levers of control that people have to find capacity and sustain it?
Amazing. You guys talk a lot about human sustainability, and that's kind of where our conversation started. Have you, it's been a little while since we've had sort of that last conversation, and we've been working with you guys sort of on and off over that period. Have you found that how you're talking to businesses about that has changed, or how businesses are talking to you about that has changed over the last sort of couple of years?
I think there's been advancement in how organisations feel about building sustainability into the careers of their people. There's definitely been progress there. I think lots of businesses are still grappling with what that looks like. How do we do that? We've got to also layer on the complexity of the global economic markets at the moment. I mean, it's just a minefield, isn't it? And it gets more and more complex and more difficult. So however hard organisations are trying to build that sustainability into their practices, it's a kind of the goal that they're aiming for is continually moving away from them. It gets harder and harder and harder. So we've seen increasing intent and with some success, but not always attainable.
A lot of your work has to do with how people feel, which has always been something in businesses that we know have been terrified of the concept of feelings, I think. Maybe terrified is the wrong word, but just don't acknowledge what that means and can you explain feelings in a business sense and what you mean by why it's important
I mean, it is. People are a little bit more open to having discussions about feelings. I think the terror that it used to create has probably eased a little, but it's still a pretty alien concept in most people's sort of business language. Feelings are really data. They are biological signals telling us how well resourced we are to meet the demands that we're facing in our environment. So feelings, for many people, are probably the most important data they have to tell them how able they are likely to meet the demands of their environment to be successful, yet routinely organizations, or rather the environment that organizations create, encourage people to stifle or hide or mask how they feel, so they're actually removing possibly the most important data from their data set and replacing it by spending more energy in masking how they feel. So that conversation we're finding is landing a lot easier with HR professionals and C-suite leaders.
I think back to your point, Damien, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment. You sort of look out the window and it sort of can sometimes feel a bit like a bonfire. With geopolitical issues, there's climate issues, there are economic productivity and growth in the UK. There's a huge amount of sort of daily things that people are worried about in their jobs because of those things, but also outside of their jobs as well. And I suppose not recognising that is part of that key problem.
One of the central focuses of our work is to try to build some kind of certainty and clarity for people, because that horizon just doesn't seem to exist for many people. You know, whether you're young and entering the market or our age, that uncertainty is absolutely dominating, and it enters every facet of our lives. And so one of the things we work with leadership to do is to really try and create that sense of certainty and clarity for people. And if you can do that, you'll see a higher level of engagement and commitment from your teams and your people. It's a quid pro quo.
I think that's probably one of the biggest changes we felt, that when we created certainty we work in an environment, particularly around sustainability, where it's very easy to go down a dark rabbit holes about what isn't going well, or the problems, or how large they are. And one of the things that we've worked on, particularly with the team, and I think especially over the last few months, is around having certainty, or knowing where to anchor yourself in what you're doing and how to doing. And it's had a remarkable effect, I think, on our company culture. I think everyone just feels more, or the classic, or more stable when we anchor ourselves to certain things when there is so much uncertainty that we can't control.
That's right. Control the things you can control. And most people struggle even to identify what they are and focus in on them. But when you do that's absolutely a building block of building high performance in any organisation. Yeah.
So the Keep Britain Working review recently came out, and they talk about a culture of fear where sick people drop out of work rather than seek support. Employers are afraid to talk about it. And we're also seeing conversations from the government about, or from certain parties, about getting people back to work and not giving people as much sort of grace necessarily within sort of welfare and social welfare. What is it you think the businesses are missing the trick on? Why is this culture of fear still here in 2026?
So I think so much has changed since we last spoke. So we had a slight well-being angle on things when we spoke. We were just coming out of COVID. But CIPD data that's come out, the most recent sickness from work to absence and sickness, 9.4 days sick in 2024. So nearly 2 whole weeks of sick, an average employee. That's up from 7.8 in 2023. And pre-COVID, it's up over 60% from 5.8. So what it's saying is that sickness and absence isn't a blip from COVID. It is now anchored in the workplace experience. And it's now moving to a phenomenal cost for business. So it's moved away from a well-being, which was always a bit of a sideshow, nice to have agenda, to a critical performance and cost management issue. And mental ill health is one of the largest reasons for absence, and in long-term absence is the largest. And we have to be very clear, 80% of poor mental health stems from our feelings becoming dysregulated, mood and emotion. So how we feel is critical and the driving force of this absence of sickness pandemic. If it's not a pandemic, it's the reality of what's going on in workplaces of Britain.
Yeah, we've got to create, when we talk about sustainability, people's sustainability, we've got to really focus in on how do we create an environment at work that feels sustainable for people. People will opt out one way or the other if their role, if the business that they're working in doesn't feel like the environment is sustainable for them. One of the most primary drivers is, do I feel well? And I think people will opt out either through sickness or through looking for other work. And in the absence of there being other work available, and we know the markets are tough, particularly for young people, particularly with the disruption of AI, that people will opt out in another way. And what we've got to do, and we do have it within our gift, to create that sense of sustainability for people. I don't want to pile more on leadership and management, but because the world is hard enough for them as it is. but we have to upskill them to create those environments for their people. And it really does start at the desk. We can blame the world for this state of turmoil, but ultimately it comes down to our behaviours on a daily basis with our people.
And even on the news today on the BBC, there's a whole thing about the co-op. And senior management have written a letter to all the board directors talking about a culture of fear, terrible decisions being made, no one can speak up. So this is like safety at work playing out at an extraordinarily senior level in what many would consider to be, the flag bearer of high quality, ethical or business management. So it plays out in all kinds of environments. And if people don't feel safe at work, it's a feeling. It isn't a mindset. You can't wake up one morning and cognitively say, I'm going to decide to feel safe today. You either feel it or you don't. And in fact, when we think about organizations and any of the characteristics that organizations would love to have them described as, these traits like engaging, trusting, collaborative, all of those words are feelings. Yet no organizations are investing in, well, where do they come from? How do we create an environment that creates those? How do I create them in myself? And that's where we're getting a little bit more traction, because there's a bit of it's almost a bit of a light bulb for some of the more forward-thinking organizations we're engaging with. This stuff's important, and feelings, as we go right back to the beginning, are signals of our capacity to do all the enormous amounts of work to meet the enormous demands that are being placed on the modern employee in the modern business.
What we do with working with businesses, we go nowhere near, any of the stuff that you're doing or as deep. But what we often speak to businesses around when we're talking about ESG is the S and the G being as important as the E. And I think this is a really good example of the co-op today and sort of what has come out and what will probably continue to come out over the next few weeks as we learn more and etc. is that understanding the social impact that you're having as a business on the staff, on the communities that you're working with, and understanding how important the governance is in how that is trickled through an organisation and what that looks like, as you say, at the managership and leadership level is vitally important and as important as the E. And you can't have one without the other because cracks start to appear.
Yeah, if you're not investing in leadership behaviours, in governance and the things that determine how people feel, all this kind of well-being spend, it's not well-being, it's like compensation for harm. That's what you're doing. You're just putting a plaster over the harm that your environment is causing your people.
You spoke earlier about data and about feelings being incredible data that a lot of businesses use. So how on earth would you measure feelings? I mean, I imagine there's a few businesses out there. Where would they get started? And how do you build, I suppose, how do you understand that and what do you do? And then how do you actually transfer that into an insight and into a learning proposition and skills? And I don't want to give away all of the secrets, but, where would somebody even start thinking about this?
Well, perhaps I'll give us a high level and then I'll leave Jonathan to go into the detail. He's the biologist in the room. Ultimately, what we're really interested in is what is causing feeling. So many of the feelings we experience at work are negative. Everything we've discussed leads to that conclusion, but it's not always the case. We can elicit very strong positive emotions in people in the workplace. What we're interested in is what is causing that feeling, sometimes intense feeling or lack of feeling. We differentiate between mood and emotion. Emotion being a stress response to something that's happening in the external environment. Mood being a stress response, which is really triggered by our internal homeostatic reporting mechanisms. That sounds a bit technical. Think of one being internal and one being external in terms of what's causing these mood or emotion responses. But they are biological stress. That's the most important thing. They're giving us information to do something, change something. And what we do is we suppress them, ignore them. And I think most organizations actually just do that. They don't actively think of people expressing how they feel as a negative necessarily or try to, suppress that, but they just ignore it. And that's critical performance data that we can work with. So our models are very much, so we'll simplify quite complex science. Chris, our co-founder, who's a professor in cognitive neuroscience, has put a huge amount of 3 decades worth of research into our models, but it has to be simplified, has to be really, really simple and accessible for leaders and managers to use and deploy. And that's what we do. We take quite complex areas of science and make them really easily usable models.
I oversimplify everything that you tell me because that's how I go. But I
Give us an example. Go on.
genuinely walk around, and if I start to get stressed after our conversations about reptilian brain and mammalian brain, I genuinely sometimes think, which of one of these is reacting? Am I hungry, thirsty, tired? Do I need to go and walk around the block and get some sunlight? And it's a genuine question that I now have in my head of, I've suddenly realised I feel a way. Why is it that I feel away? Is it because I've not been looking after myself, and is it my internal, or is it that something's happened and I'm reacting to somebody or something that has happened? And it genuinely helps how I deal with things, because sometimes I do need to just go and get a glass of water.
Lovely. Yeah, quite.
And go for a walk around the block and come back and start again and go, okay, that's what it was. Actually, it's me.
And Jonathan, I'm sure, will chat about the 4R model of people sustainability in organisations, which is a research white paper. But that recognition of Alex, you're incredibly self-aware. So working with you was an absolute joy and relatively easy for us. A lot of the people we work with are not aware at all of feelings, and that inhibition that they've perfected over 4 decades in a lot of cases is really in control. So they're not aware of feelings at all and really struggle to connect with feelings. And what you've just described, which is based on Paul MacLean's triune brain theory, is a really lovely, simple model for people to use to start to recognize, okay, where is this feeling coming from? Unless you know where it's coming from, you can't do anything with it. Yeah. But yeah, you're ahead of the curve.
Oh, well, that's very kind. As I say, very oversimplified, but it does work.
And when we going back to like mood and emotion, we actually have a method by which we measure mood. We record mood data with our clients, and then we analyse that, and we do a lot of complex reporting with our clients on mood, how their mood tracks through the day. And remember, mood is a signal telling you how well resourced you are to meet your goals. So it's important data. But mood is biological stress. So if you are not dealing with what that mood information is telling you, you are then operating in a stressed way. And when you have biological stress, it impacts how you view the world, how you view information, how you view other people. It influences and biases your decision making and how you process information. So mood and emotions, when they are not dealt with, are changing the way you're operating as a leader. And that's really important to know. So they're not just fluffy, ephemeral things. They are real, hard biological facts. They are biological stress that change the way we feel. And tracking that data gives leaders really powerful insights to how they're doing, and then it develops their self-awareness. And a self-aware leader is a much better leader to work for. When we talk about leadership shadow, that's a biological phenomenon. It's exactly if you were my leader, Alex, you would make me feel a certain way. And now if you were coming in tired and angry and all of those things that you talked about in your reptilian brain, your shadow would influence how I feel. It would make me feel threatened. And when I feel threatened, I start looking for things. I become disengaged. I start losing trust. And all of these things are happening in workplace environments all of the time, yet they are not talked about, discussed, or used as important areas of development for the people who, for many people, create those feelings in others.
Yeah, to put another spin on it, we're really interested in the system, the workplace system, the team system. And the dynamic between team member and team leader is critically important, and it's a bi-directional relationship. So what Jonathan has just described is if you come in as the leader of a group with a certain mood, what we would call a disrupted mood in our terminology, because let's say you didn't sleep because of whatever reason, then you are going to come in and have a different perception of the world, a different perception of my work ethic, how much effort I'm putting in, all of that kind of thing. And that biases our relationship. Equally, I need, as a member of your team, to be in a good place, because otherwise my perceptions of how you're leading are going to be severely biased and disrupted. So mood is a critical data point for everybody in the team. And I need to know what I'm bringing. I need to know whether I can trust my perceptions of what's happening to me, what's happening in the external world. No doubt, if someone drinks heavily, sleeps badly, doesn't exercise, eats rubbish, all of these things that are core foundational elements of a typical wellbeing program, which is why wellbeing is so important. If all of those things are out of place, the world seems unapproachable and unmanageable, and I am way more likely to leave, and I'm way more likely to leave because I think I'm being done to, and all of these things.
I was just, and it's a slight tangent, and probably taken out, but I was just imagining all of the TV shows and the movies where I've seen images of leadership and how many follow that profile of heavy drinking, no exercise, almost glamorizing that bad mood sort of relationship between people. And there's very rarely, I think, good leadership shown in the media, actually. I could name...
Doesn't make good TV, does it?
It doesn't make good TV, does it? Yeah. But it's really interesting to see how that's how it's modelled to us in sort of those media pieces as well.
What we never meet is a leader who doesn't want their people to really enjoy working with them. It's very unusual. And then it's time for that person to be, and we will help the organisation maybe come to that conclusion. But no, generally leaders really want things to work and want to have high levels of engagement with their teams. So there's lots we can do with people like that.
And in that sort of wider worldview piece, we have started, and this is not sort of data that we are collecting, but things that we are starting to sense as an organisation, that people are changing the way they speak out into the world. Both, we do a lot of materiality assessments, stakeholder materiality, going and asking how they feel about climate, environment, social, economic, diversity, equity and inclusion. And I think we are seeing a trend in the type of language that is coming back in off those materiality assessments that is not necessarily as positive. People are quite negative about things. They are using language that I don't think we would necessarily saw at all 3 or 4 years ago. But also on a personal thing, I feel like I'm seeing that on LinkedIn and other sort of social media places at the moment, that people seem to have there is a negative, more divisive, more polarized language that's being used on a regular, not just anonymized through stakeholder materiality, but also people out there in the world. Is there a connection there to mood, emotions, workplace, what's going on in the world?
I think there's a connection in everything that humans do to mood, emotion, and what have you. I'm reading a book by Jonathan Haidt right now, and he talks about our mind as being a driver on an elephant, and our feelings are the elephant. We think our mind is in control, but if that elephant wants to do something, we have no control over it whatsoever. And I just thought it's a fabulous metaphor. And I think everything that we do, so that when we think about interpersonal risk, things that would have been frowned upon 2 or 3 years ago that were being said are no longer frowned upon. In fact, there might be people who celebrate that. So my risk of losing any kind of social status or how I'm valued in my social group, that algorithm has changed. And if you're a free speech absolutist, you might say for the better. If you've got very strong progressive views, you might say for the worse. But I think that the biology of interpersonal risk has fundamentally shifted, and I am no longer at risk for saying things that perhaps 2 or 3 years ago would have had me really marginalised, cancelled or whatever.
And how are you finding it? So businesses are struggling at the moment, I think, to maybe keep the best talent. It is a really interesting market for employers and employees at the moment. Yeah. We're definitely seeing that the changes in what that looks like for us, but I'm very aware that that's in the bigger picture. How can businesses ensure that they keep their talent? And I mean, I know you've spoken a lot about understanding, but is there any sort of practical steps that you would put in place for them to or even like day one, just think about this?
Yeah, I think actually I've got quite a good example of a client of ours, but I do think it's about creating the environment. We operate within systems that we tend to measure in processes and physical, technical systems, but actually we're talking about an emotional network, really in a team or organization. And I think what we have to do is it's not only important from a performance perspective, but also an engagement perspective, get people to feel good whilst being at work. So just to give you an example, I'm meeting someone later today, actually. She was a client, and she was very senior HR in a very, very large global engineering firm. And she was in charge of D&I. And she spent 5 or 6 years in that role, pushing the agenda, very little engagement, really thankless over a long period of time in a, I think, 85% male organization globally. So gender diversity was central to her work. She gave up. She actually couldn't try any harder, any longer. And about a year ago moved back into the senior governance role that she had held before in a different organization. And that different organization she's been with for a few months. And the work is not the work that she wants to be doing, but she feels fantastic. She loves the organization. She loves the value that people put on her work, her contribution, etc. It's a pretty stark lesson that is not necessarily what you're doing, it's who you're doing it with and in what environment. So we would say start there. Start to upskill people to think about the environment slightly differently.
And we're a social species, and I think we think we're incredible, but we're just a social mammal, like lots of other social mammals on the planet, and we have core needs. We need to feel included. We need to feel valued. We need to feel fairly or equitably treated. We need autonomy, a sense of control over how we perform, and we need certainty or clarity. If you have all of those things in abundance, typically they'll come from your leader, but they'll also come from the system in which you're operating. You feel good. So things like discretionary effort, engagement, trust, collaboration will all flow. Psychological safety will flow. If you do not have those things, you are emotionally triggered, which means you are biologically stressed. And if you can't resolve those things, if you're permanently in an environment where those things are being triggered, at some point that becomes intolerable. So you will either burn out. If you really love what you're doing, you probably couldn't leave, so you'll probably burn out. If you don't really love what you're doing, you'll leave. You'll look for an environment that doesn't biologically stress you.
I mean, quiet quitting, I think, became quite a buzzword in 2025. I think those 5 words that you just used, which I know you talk about a lot, but I think it's worth people having in the back of their heads and having as part of their own vocabulary: certainty, inclusion, autonomy, attachment, and equity. And I don't think they're used actually enough in businesses to actually explain, but it makes so much sense when you start to understand it as you say, as a social being. And
if leaders approach leading their teams with those 5 needs at the front of how they operate, that's putting feelings at the heart of how you do business. Is a very, very straightforward model to use, and I think it's a great starting point.
I think previously we've talked about, and going back to your example, Damien, of diversity without understanding the power of feelings will never work. Is that why you see so many DEI initiatives that have failed? Or, a great example of somebody that very passionate about it in an organisation, wants to do something and they haven't been able to push it. Is that where the disconnect, do you think, is?
It really is different in every example. I think in that specific case, it was just too low down the priority list. It just, businesses are under pressure. People, leaders are under pressure. There's no question that we have to pick our battles, so to speak, as business leaders. And I think, there's no doubt that with everything that's going on in the world, particularly the last year or two, that DEI has dropped down people's agenda. We are firmly trying to keep it up there.
Well, with you.
At the forefront. Yeah. Because
for all of the right reasons. And not,
it is critical to organisational profitability, to performance, and it absolutely fundamental. And D&I should... Yeah, and D&I should pervade every aspect of how people operate within an organisation. It should be natural, shouldn't it?
I think it became highly politicised, and that's problematic. If you think about it from a evolutionary biological perspective, diversity is critical in solving problems and dealing with challenge. Businesses have never faced more challenges. So diversity of thought, having different outlooks and creative solutions is where the businesses will thrive and succeed. So it's diversity of thought, just as diversity in our gene pool is extraordinarily important to help us fight diseases, etc., etc. And diversity of stress responses. Is fight correct? Is flight correct? Is actually tending and befriending, making coalitions the correct stress response to this challenge. And then when we think about equity and inclusion, they are biological needs that we all have. All of us have those needs. They're not a HR pie chart. They are critical for engagement, trust, collaboration, and any other high quality trait you would like your business to be described as.
And if you want productivity and growth and high performance,
people need to feel included and equitably treated.
And want to be there and want to be high performance and productive and growth focused.
Yeah. That's right. And D&I's unfortunately kind of acquired a label that it's almost like a cause within an organisation. That's how it's seen. And it can't be. It's got to be attached to performance, organisational.
Yeah, and an awful lot of it was performative. An awful lot of it was highly inauthentic. So actually probably quite insulting to the people it may be trying to champion. So I think it had huge problems, and therefore it's having a crisis. But you go back to the critical need of a business to perform better. Diversity of thought's important, and people need to feel included and equitably treated, or they will leave, or they won't speak up, or they won't perform as well as you'd like.
And this is the Business of Sustainability podcast. And I think probably the same conversation could be had around sustainability. I think I get asked at least once, if not many more times daily, how is Trump affecting what you're doing? Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. I did ask you that a couple of weeks ago.
It's the sort of the go-to question, and I think it's really interesting. And we have. I think people have got quite entrenched in their views, and I think we always come back to it's around business and to those things. If you want to have all of the good things that you would like a business to be, you'd like it to be profitable, successful, resilient, risk managed. If you'd like to have a group of people that want to turn up and work with you every day and try their hardest, sustainability inevitably feeds into that, especially our broader sense of what sustainability means across the themes, and that social and environmental impact is going to feed into it. So for us, the business requirement still sits there. It's removing that politicalisation of what that means. And I think everybody wants most people want the same things. I wrote something about it the other day. Most people want to, they don't want litter on the floor. They'd like to swim in a sea or visit a river that's safe, and air to breathe that feels clean. You like to know that something you've bought hasn't negatively affected anybody else, no matter where they are in the world. There's a whole variety of things that I think all of us just want. We want to live in a good place, and that trickles down into business they are part of our society, and so there is an expectation of them to maintain that as in that ecosystem. I just think it got a little bit confused at some stage.
No, that's right. And belonging happens at multiple different levels for every individual within an organisation. I need to belong at my desk with my colleagues, etc. But I need to belong to an organisation that really cares. I need to belong to an organisation that feels it belongs in this ecosystem and this planet, doesn't it? And is playing its role. It's fundamentally important that people belong to something bigger than just the desk they sit at in the business. And they don't necessarily all have to touch that every day, but people want to be proud of that. And I think it's a fundamental part of it. It's part of the work we do is how do we as organisations create that sense of belonging at multiple different levels. And what you're describing and the work you're doing, which is why we're so attached to the work that you do at FuturePlus, is fundamental.
And I suppose the opposite question to that is, if when companies launch sustainability programs, whether that be the climate, environmental, social, whether that be sort of a full gamut of sustainability, and they get resistance or apathy, from a biological perspective, what's going on there? If a company is trying to do better and they get pushback, where does that sit with that sort of learning and foundational
It depends.
knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, it really just depends how it lands. If it just feels like you're being done to, you don't have a say in it, that can feel you've lost autonomy, you've probably had increased workload, it's not fair. So there could be a whole bunch of things that a very poorly launched program, however well intentioned, can actually cause quite strong negative feelings, which means people don't engage with it, they don't trust it, and it will quite possibly just wither, or it certainly won't deliver the upside that the consultant sold in, which is clearly not what anyone wants.
Yeah. So we talk, I mean, as I say, we do a lot of stakeholder materiality, but also so much time is spent trying to understand why. Yeah. If you can figure out why you're doing this and you can confidently say at all levels through the business why it's important, it's amazing how quickly that resistance and apathy disappears. But it's got, as you say, everybody's got to feel that it is relevant to them and that it is something that is valuable and useful.
And this authenticity gap is how I feel about the organisation. If there's a gap between how I feel about the organisation and what the organisation is saying, so if I don't feel well towards the organisation because my experience is negative, yet the organisation is spouting all of these wonderful things, that inauthenticity gap, that just creates disengagement, cynicism. So how the environment that organisation creates chimes with what it says it's doing is critical.
So I think we're running out of time a little bit, although I could sit and have a conversation with you guys for absolute hours. A couple of last things to ask you. What is an uncomfortable truth about workplace wellbeing that you consistently have to have with leaders? Is there something that consistently comes up that is a sort of a starting point for someone to go away and think about?
I think we may have used this phrase on our first time, but I think it's even truer now. Poor well-being in the workplace is not a pathological response to a great environment. It's a completely normal and predictable response to a pathological environment. And I think business leaders need to think about that as a statement.
Yeah, definitely start with the environment. And I think leaders and senior managers need to take responsibility for the fact that if there's low levels of engagement or people are struggling from a performance perspective, let's start with the system that we're creating and perpetuating in our own behaviours. I think that would be a good place to start. Generally, once people get into it and start to understand the why this is important and how they might go about this, people adopt new practices pretty quickly. They can see the power of it.
And we talk a lot of FuturePlus around ambition and progress. What would you like to see in the world that you're working in over the next few years? It's been a couple of years since we spoke. Maybe we can come back in a couple of years and have another conversation about whether or not it's come true, or any sort of predictions. But it is a tricky world at the moment. As I say, sometimes it can look like you're watching a bonfire outside your front door and trying to carry on as normal, I think. But is there anything that you would like businesses to be doing as standard or people to be doing in the next few years as a sort of seeing progress in the conversations that you're having?
I think developing an understanding and a language around personal capacity is critical for any organisation. So remember that feelings are the signals of capacity, so therefore you have to have a literacy around feelings, which I think would be phenomenal for everybody, both in work and outside of work. But if you understand capacity, then I think dealing with capability and skills becomes a very different thing. I see capacity as the biggest challenge for high productive, high quality work, not capabilities and skills.
That's right. We're going to need to unlock real ability in organisations and individuals, in teams, to think critically and be creative. That is not a mindset you can just turn up on a Monday morning with because you've decided to do it. That era of cognitive psychology has been proven to be one dimension of what we need. What we're talking about, affective psychology, is how our feelings determine our ability to think critically and creatively. And we want to see a big shift there. We want to see organisations adopting more training practices that enable their people to be those people that they expect them to be and diffuse some of this tension that currently exists.
Amazing. Well, it seems like knowledge is power on that one. But Damien, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. To find out more about CHX Performance and the work they do, please visit chxperformance.com. For more episodes and resources on building sustainable business, head to future-plus.co.uk, and you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you next time.